Right, well, we've been here a few times before, haven't we? Lots of speeches over the last couple of years. I think this is about my fourth in the last 2 or 3 years at different events and all the rest of it. And in that sense, I'll apologise for going over for what CPGB comrades will regard as old ground in some ways. But quite clearly, this is an important discussion. An anecdote, I suppose, to underline its importance. Common students comrades in Manchester have a weekly game they play when they go to the Socialist Workers' Party stall. They get the new copy of Socialist Worker and go through, and they actually stand there, and it's the first one to find a page without a reference to without the word Nazi in it wins a prize. Apparently, I mean, I'm not saying they're spending their time as productively as they should be, but it does indicate something about the way in which this question has become, particularly for the Socialist Workers' Party and United Against Fascism, a sort of fetish, but not only for the SWP, as I will endeavour to explain. Because this fetish, in particular of the no platform for fascists line as a sort of iron principle, particularly that, because it's a legacy of Stalinism, the Stalinized Comintern, and its development of that position, this fetish is particularly negative, because what it actually does is force these comrades, both on the Stalinist left, but also on the anti-Stalinist left or non-Stalinist left, to constantly revise, move away from, and indeed even ditch fundamental Marxist ABCs on the question of the state, on the question of democracy, and on the question of working class political independence. Now, for some comrades on the left, this might be reflective of me saying, well, this is typical CPGB, theoretical nitpicking, etc., while the EDL roam the streets and all the rest, fiddling while Rome burns or whatever. But it's clearly not. For Marxists, clarity about the forces that are confronting us and about what they are, what they represent, etc., is absolutely essential. Looking to gain some sort of understanding and definition of what these forces are is absolutely imperative to our own perspectives and then dealing with them. Particularly with the government that we have in front of us now and its promises of cuts, further social dislocation, the crisis in Afghanistan, etc. These questions are not going to go away. We live in fairly potentially dangerous times. Things can move quickly. But it's certainly not nitpicking to point out, comrades, that we on the left are failing massively in dealing with the far right. There are legion examples of this that reeling them off starts to get rather depressing as you get into example 251. But you've got the BNP and the Queen Garden Party. The Queen being reminded that she's not only the head of Britain but the head of the Commonwealth, and how offensive it was to have someone like BNP representatives at a garden party. We've got even the most basic thing of I was at the PCS conference with Lee, and actually seeing leading members of the Socialist Party in England and Wales getting up and saying, well, do you know the BNP's views, they're really offensive, and that's actually why we have to press the employers to make sure that any BNP members are sacked. All right, we have to carry that out. Another example. Martin Smith on September the 7th is actually on trial with serious charges against him, could face prison for his current practice of basically chasing the English Defence League around the country wherever it raises its ugly thing. But I thought it was the EDL, but okay. But it's a related question. And the list goes on and on. But really, in prefacing this discussion, I want to just point comrades out to something that Jack Straw, that wonderfully principled leftist, said after Question Time, after Nick Griffin's appearance on Question Time. He said, what Question Time showed was that there's something decent in British politics running through in society, from the UK Independence Party to the Socialist Workers' Party. And I think if that... you can laugh at it, but what it is an utter indictment, really, of where we are at the moment in dealing with the far right. Now, as shown by the CS Manchester example, and spot the page without the word Nazi, fascism is a term, and Nazi and terms, I guess, are bandied around often without any concrete definition. More really like a swear word than anything else. A bit like Neil from The Young Ones, you know, whenever someone does something naughty, it's fascist. And it's a little bit like that. So you can get speakers saying, well, this is fascist, that's fascist, and it certainly at times will then create a certain mood of radicalism and militancy, possibly, and gee on the forces that they're speaking to. But it cannot be used as Marxist. Such a term cannot just be thrown about. It has to be a category that's politically clear of what it means, what it represents, and, as I say, how then our perspectives flow from that. It allows us to differentiate between forms of reaction, say, like Pinochet or the Peterloo massacre, and differentiate them from the organised crushing of the working class movement we saw across Europe in the 20s, 30s, and indeed 40s. So what is fascism, and what sort of definition should we be looking to give it? I've been part of the CPGB majority position on this in the past couple of years, and basically still defend that basic outline, which basically says that fascism is, if you like, counter-revolution in extremis, but it's a specific form of counter-revolution that comes from below, with a mass base that's organised essentially as a social battering ram, in particular against the far left and the workers' movement, as we've seen. It doesn't really have a single ideology, and to sort of underline this, I was reading an article by leading SWP and Martin Smith the other day, where he said, well, the EDL were out saying that they were blaming the lack of jobs on migrants. This is typical of fascism. Okay, well, Gordon Brown, British jobs for British workers. This is typical of fascism. It's not typical of fascism. It can take all sorts of form, but there's no single ideology. In looking to understand what happened in Germany and Italy, the Comintern advanced numerous definitions, some of which are far better than others. But what Trotsky and Thalheimer in particular emphasized, which I think is very useful in looking at fascism, where it comes from, what it is, was the so-called Bonapartist element, i.e., after the fall of Louis Philippe's monarchy, where no class in society could particularly assert its own agenda, where there's chaos and decay, there comes a man who basically organises what in French is called la bohème, the lumpens, the soldiers, etc., into a force that basically can then assert itself, creating a new regime, which as I say is completely new. So for us, what marks out fascism is that approach of fighting squads organised independently of the state forces initially, but as they've proven themselves to become a bit more of a force, they can then be turned on by the state in times of utter social crisis and decay, like we saw in post-World War I society in Italy and later on in Germany. And what you can see with this, there's a common thread throughout these counter-revolutionary forces, is something that you could broadly call a shirtist movement. So obviously you had Hitler's shirtist movement, you had the black shirts of Mussolini, but there's also precursors of that at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Action Française, France for the French, again were anti-Semitic, extremely nationalistic forces that basically carried out attacks on the workers' movement. Or a better-known example from history of Bolshevism is, of course, the Black Hundreds and the pogromists, those. But crucially, the coming into existence of these parties, and for them to actually take power, they were initially quite marginal and looked upon by the ruling forces with a certain disdain and disgust, if you like. They didn't represent much, but as crisis then came, they could be employed. And in their organised crushing of the workers' movement, particularly in Germany and Italy, what you saw was not just a setback for the working class, i.e. just a normal defeat, as it were, but actually a strategic defeat that has implications for a much longer period, and in a certain sense, it is even felt today in some way, because the defeat, in particular of the German working class, was that systemic, was that complete and total, that it had disastrous effects. What about the BNP and the EDL then? We need to jump forward slightly from these broad definitions. I'll come back then onto how some of the Comintern definitions were wrong and lead to wrong perspectives, which are actually today still around, as we can quite clearly see. Well, it's well known that the BNP and some of its leading members have openly Nazi backgrounds, and that's quite obvious where they come from and what they're about. But we also have to explain, not just we also have to look at the world not just in fixed categories, but we have to actually explain change and how things are changing. We have to explain continuity, discontinuity, and I think it's quite clear that under Griffin there's been a conscious shift away from the streets and mobilising on the streets as an attacking force against the left, as we've seen, say, with the National Front, etc. It's been a shift away from that onto a fight for the seats, if you like, a fight for clawing its way into councils, getting influence in the European Parliament, for example. And quite clearly, this strategy that's been adopted by Griffin has sort of paid off. I know they were squeezed, particularly for their councillors in the last election, but it's certainly been working. And the point is that when you start to carry out a course of politics, you can actually start to become what you're trying to do. So Griffin, of course, will say in these written articles about it that we're taking this turn, this electoral turn. We're only initiating the hardcore with the real truth about Zionism, about this, that, and the other. But people aren't interested in that at the moment. What we need to do is talk to them about what really affects them, what they're really worried about, and that's largely, obviously, then Muslims, etc., and whip up fear and hatred and ignorance around these questions in order to advance ourselves. And I've used the analogy before, and other comrades have as well. It's a little bit, in that sense, like John Rees. If you look at John Rees, the ex-leading member of the SWP now in Counterfire, he quite explicitly made a turn in the SWP, the Respect Turn, and he said it at the founding conference. Look, it's not about class struggle. It's not about Marxism. It's not about the Communist Party. It's not about that history. Obviously that matters, but the people outside of this room, they matter more. We need to give them what they're currently interested in. They don't care about Lenin and the Bolsheviks and all the rest of it. There's a similar thing there. And as I say, the problem with that approach is that you can actually start to, if you think that way, you can actually start to become it. That's quite clear in John Rees's history. And obviously this turn has not come without its pressures and reactions from members of the BNP and also society at large. I mean, it wasn't for nothing that in the run-up to this election, there were lots of talks of death threats, palace coups, which I know the media seized upon for obvious reasons. When you do something, when you take a turn like that, it's not often without resistance. Question time is a good example as well. So the BNP start to establish itself as a force. Nick Griffin gets invited on to Question Time, and again, if you're watching that as a sort of hardcore Nazi, or if you're watching it and you've seen Nick Griffin and he's questioned on the Holocaust, and he says, well, for legal reasons I can't possibly say anything about that, and I was wrong, I think he says at one point as well, etc., etc. It's hardly somebody going out there and giving the message, and that does underline these tensions within the course that he's taking. It's a bit like, for example, if Mark goes on Question Time and I'm watching as a member of the CPGB and he says, well, 1917, well, it sort of matters, but it wasn't that important, and it's a similar sort of effect. So you can see, just from the outside, that you can anticipate some of the tension that could have been created. I can't remember who it was now, but basically castigated, a leading BNP member castigated Nick Griffin for not taking on the agenda of the ethnic middle class, as he calls it, openly, and that's certainly not what Nick Griffin did on Question Time. And obviously in the last year, we've seen changes really on the far right as well, in that we've seen the rise of, I said the rise, it's slightly overestimating it, but we've seen the emergence of the English Defence League. Now for some, almost exclusively across the left, this is proof that Griffin is still a Nazi and that the EDL are just the boots of Griffin's suits in the BNP. They are the fighting wing of the BNP. They might not say so, etc., but that's clearly what they are. I think you have to look at Griffin's reaction. Again, somebody, as I say, who's coming under tension. His initial reaction to the EDL is to call them a Zionist false flag operation. And with Eddie Butler, I think the membership secretary, saying this is a proscribed organisation. There's no way that we're going to allow our members, the BNP members, to go and join this organisation. Now, of course, there's a crossover. We know people like Chris Renton, who did the EDL website, is a BNP member. And there's a lot of capital being made now of a guy called Tommy Robinson, who's a leading member of the EDL, but is actually an ex-BNP member. So there's a big thing about, but he is ex-BNP. He makes that quite clear. So with this reaction of Griffin to the emergence of the EDL, what can we sort of say? Well, I would argue, again, based on the definitions I've outlined of fascism as an independent fighting formation that goes for the streets, we are seeing the BNP. Who knows what will happen? It's certainly in flux, but we're seeing the BNP leadership under Griffin move away from that sort of perspective. But with the EDL, and I'll come on to what that is and what it's about in a second. With the EDL, you can certainly say that the opposite is the case, i.e. that whatever this formation is, however disorientated it is, however small it is at the moment, its emphasis and its approach is certainly going the other way, i.e. moving towards some sort of fascistic force fighting formation on the streets. And I think you can actually see that in their development, I won't say ideological development, but in some of the stuff that they're putting out increasingly from where they started and where they are now. So, as I say, given the period we're in, that's actually quite worrying. It's quite likely that social tension will increase, and maybe the EDL can cohere itself into something a bit more powerful than it is now. But what is the English Defence League? I mean, basically, it touts Englishness or Welshness or Scottishness against Islam. Right? So the Islamists are taking over. Alan Lake is a leading guy in the campaign against the Islamification of Europe. Has some friends in the far right in Sweden giving talks about it, and he is basically a computer entrepreneur, small bourgeois sort of background, who is quite clear that in his aim to stop the Islamification of Europe, and obviously in that Britain, he's quite keen on mobilising what he calls the high polloi, and with football casuals that the EDL consists of, the divisions of the EDL consist of, you've obviously got a force that can be easily made into that. He calls them of a fighting street army, is what he's referred to. His plans for that particular organisation, obviously puts a lot of money and time into it. And so quite obviously, if you look at the pictures, and this is a point we made in the weekly work, I think, Danny, a couple of times, if you look at the pictures of these demonstrations and see who these people are, you've got that, as I say, the Lake class element of it, but you've also got people you can define as working class in some sense. They look and I don't know if speak, but look certainly a bit like me and you on most of us, albeit maybe with slightly different haircuts and fashion senses. But you can definitely see that there's a working class element to it. Again, these are people who are extremely disillusioned with society, feel that they have no power in their lives, can't explain the relationship, say, between their exploitation, that a misery of their lives, with something like Afghanistan and the way that connects as a project. And clearly, these are people who are fairly desperate and turn to vent their frustrations in certain kinds of ways. And quite clearly, they're looking to be led at the moment by this guy, Alan Lake, with his particular project. But what you started off with, and they were quite clear, comes from this. If you want to say it's the fighting wing of something, it's the fighting wing of the casuals movement, really. In some sense, these things are extremely volatile. They can turn in on themselves fairly quickly, as we saw, I think, in Dudley, where the a couple of EDLers desperate to get to the Unite Against Fascism protesters basically start fighting with the stewards, and then that pulls in other people. There's video footage of it online, etc. But it's an extremely volatile organisation in its infancy. So we're sort of predicting. We don't have a crystal ball, but we're taking predictions about what it could become. But like I say, given what it is at the moment, given the focus it's got, it's certainly worrying. And it starts off as well. Initially, it's talking about, well, we're ordinary non-racist citizens. We feel second-class citizens to what they call the jihadists, right? But increasingly, and again, this is worrying. Partly because of this relationship they have with this hostile relationship with Unite Against Fascism. They're increasingly on their website talking about the communist menace, the communist threat, embodied by that guy Tony Woodley, well-known revolutionary communist who, with all his money, walks in the corridors of power, etc., etc. So it's quite clearly they are looking at the left in some way. Unite Against Fascism, they deem to be a government front, or it's definitely a David Cameron front, is what they basically call it. Because as we all know, David Cameron, given the approach of Unite Against Fascism, has obviously got an email into his inbox and said, "Oh, that's all very well and jolly, I'll sign that," and he's a signatory to Unite Against Fascism, which they make a big play of. So they're obviously as well on that basic level saying we are anti-establishment, Unite Against Fascism has been in tow with Cameron and all yada yada yada. So again, these are slightly worrying trends. They're still very small though, and disorganised and all the rest of it. I think the only real mobilisation that really got lots of numbers in relative terms was the one in Luton. Is it Wilson Bassett, or we had the Al Mujaroon people demonstrating?
East Anglia Regiment March.
That's right. Luton. That's right. Luton. Yeah.
The Muslim.
Yeah, Al Mujaroon. Yeah.
Came from that.
Yeah, Al Mujaroon is the sort of extremist Islamist group. I think they were involved with the some attacks on George Galloway as well, for politicising and mobilising Muslims in East London, etc. And basically, it's quite interesting. Well, Martin Smith, in describing this mobilisation, because you can understand if that's happening, if soldiers come back and people are saying, well, child killers, murderers, etc., that's going to have. Obviously not just in the media, but locally have some sort of effect on the population. Martin Smith describes that occasion as when a group of young Muslims turned up outside, not actually like they're walking from the mosque down the street or something. Do you mean not organised actual Islamist forces? Doesn't even mention the fact that who these people are. But I say that there's still small mobilisations, and for some reason the left as a whole, not just the SWP and the UF, sees it as sort of God-given duty to follow this organisation around the country wherever it shows up, whether it's in Wales and Scotland, the Welsh Defence League, the Scottish Defence League. So you wouldn't want to fight each other. So, I mean, these things are open to all sorts of tensions, particularly, as I say, Cardiff Swansea is a particular one. But they see it as their duty in that sense to go out and stop these people from spreading their ideas wherever it is across the country, and that's what we've seen recently. That's been almost exclusively the focus of the SWP, as it sort of flips from the previous electoral focus, etc., into getting people out onto the streets and chasing these people around. And you have to ask yourself, okay, well, where does this come from? Where does this idea that you have to, wherever, I mean, I've used the mole at the arcade game analogy before, wherever the EDL raises its head, you have to whack it and it'll go down, and then when it comes up again, you whack it again. It's what's been known as well as crushing fascism in the egg. Where does this whole idea come from, given the fact that at the well, quite palpably, the left is failing, and actually the right is well, the BNP have had electoral success, and the EDL, who knows? Who knows? They're still, say, a very strange organisation that could go anywhere. But where does this whole idea come from? Well, in order to look at that, we have to go back to, again, the definitions of fascism that were offered initially when trying to deal with this particularly new phenomenon that was little understood. It was obviously new, so it did confuse, it had a confusing effect, etc. But basically, the line of no platform for fascists can be traced back to essentially to Georgy Dimitrov and that whole Popular Frontist orientation, i.e. that fascism, is the quote, is the open terroristic dictatorship of the most imperialist elements of finance capital, so the most imperialist elements of finance capital, and that led most reactionary, that led then the commenting down the line of, well, alliances and getting into bed with the least or lesser reactionary imperialist elements of finance capital. And this is the funny thing about the left's position today, because even though, particularly in Britain, there's a whole swathe of Trotskyist organisations who claim to uphold the mantle of Trotsky's United Front, etc., etc., they are actually arguing for, as I said before, Stalinist positions on this question. And then what you had with later on, I mean, I've emphasised Trotsky's and Thalheimer's emphasis on the Bonapartist element of fascism. Radek and Zetkin, for example, stressed the fact that it's got a mass base, particularly through the force of nationalism, and that it's a counter-revolutionary movement, which basically, as Zetkin puts it, is the punishment for the failure of the working class to take power in social crisis. And that's quite obvious, as I said, in Italy and Germany in particular. But later on, in understanding it, Stalin advances the view that fascism and social democracy, because fascism for the official Comintern at that point is seen as a sort of outgrowth or logical outcome of bourgeois society and its development, Stalin advances the view that social democracy and fascism are quote-unquote twin brothers, the so-called social fascist line, which basically had more to do with the external interests of the Soviet Union under Stalin in Germany at that time than real serious analysis of it. And what that led to, as we all know, is a massively split and divided workers' movement against the rise of Hitler, with the Social Democrats on the one hand, the so-called social fascists, and the communists on the other, which easily facilitated Hitler's seizure of power. The communists thought, following that line, that it would be first Hitler and then us type thing, which proved disastrously wrong. They thought Hitler would come in and then it'd be their turn, but that wasn't the case. And only when the forces of the left, of the workers' movement as a whole, are exterminated, do they then sort of correct that. And Georgy Dimitrov comes up at the Seventh Congress with the definition I've given of popular frontism. Trotsky, and I think it's clear to, I want to make the point here, that Trotsky articulates the policy, and I think in some of his best writings, of the United Front of the working class movement, which basically says that, look, in limited, partial and largely defensive struggles, the social democracy and the communists must unite against attacks from the far right, against them advancing, etc., etc., but must always retain the ability to criticise social democracy and criticise its limitations, its illusions in the state, etc., etc., its nationalism. And that is essentially the line that we in the CPGB think is correct and should be followed. But with the rise of the Dimitrov conception of it, as I've said before, there's not unity of the workers' movement as a whole, but actually unity between the so-called Democrats against the extremists. That involves, the less imperialistic, the less terroristic, the less chauvinistic aspects of capital, and the so-called constitutional parties. And really, the idea that whenever fascist forces raise their head, their ideas have to be stopped, they have to be crushed, comes from this conception that there's something fundamentally different, fundamentally extra about fascism, which has to be dealt with immediately, even if that means giving platforms, etc., to people who aren't particularly left-wing, and on that level, David Cameron or something like that. And instead of the United Front being premised on criticism, and open criticism of the forces involved, Dimitrov takes that a step further and says, well, look, you don't really need, as long as you mobilise against the fascists, you don't really need to criticise anyone, not just the social democracy, but a local celebrity or a priest or whatever. You don't need to do that, because what you need to do is mobilise. And this is the sort of spectre of Dimitrov that haunts the Central Committee of the SWP today, I suppose. On that level, you have to prove yourselves the best fighters, because that's all that matters. If you mobilise harder than Margaret Hodge or in Dagenham, or if you push hard, by the logic of events, these people will come over to your side, right? And even Margaret Hodge, do you know what? She didn't call Griffin a Nazi before the election, but she did afterwards. I'm sure she was thankful for the votes she got as well from the UAF field. So that's the logic of it. It's basically it's about mobilisation. It's not about political struggle. It's just purely about mobilising, and you only criticise those who break that unity, who break the action involved, rather than say the conception of the United Front. And this is passed down really through the movement and developed by the official communist parties, but it's also taken up by the Trotskyists as a way of actually getting the members out, mobilising against the far right, and it's sort of just uncritically assumed, as it were, and taken for granted. And yes, now we have the situation that we have today. Really, you've got the SWP has a particularly crude and crass version of this so-called United Front, the Popular Front, with the UAF, by just getting anyone to sign up to this or that platform, etc., and to insist that it's absolutely necessary to chase groups around and stop them from articulating their ideas. But there's also if you like, a Trotskyist version of a left critique from Trotskyist groups of the SWP into doing that. It was quite well articulated by a comrade from the International Bolshevik Tendency at a meeting at Marxism a couple of months ago. And his basic position was, well, look, the SWP, in essence, are correct. It's absolutely right to go out and stop these people from spreading their poison, etc. The problem is they don't do it rigorously enough. They don't do it. They rely on the police, which is of course true. They don't go out and really show them, really smash them up. And if you look at that perspective, okay, it might seem that it's very radical and revolutionary, and I'm sure it will recruit the ones or twos from the main UAF demonstration, etc., etc. But it's not serious politics. If we see this whole chasing the far right round the country, stopping them, preventing this ideas as some sort of head banging exercise, it's basically saying, well, don't just occasionally bang your head against the wall. Do it fast and do it hard. Right? It's still couched within the terms of that mobilisation as in that popular frontist fashion. It doesn't break with that approach at all. Okay, so what is the sort of approach that can break this? Well, we have to be clear. As much as we defend the United Front, for example, the European the English Defence League could come to it's quite possible in the future they could try and break up and interfere with a an Afghanistan conference, for example. That's one of the questions which that's feasible in the future. And it's quite clear that tactically there's nothing wrong with actually dealing with that by taking measures of self-defense, even preemptively, if we know they're organising this or that. There's nothing ruled automatically in or out. It's not a principle. Right? And I don't know where it does become such a principle for the left, but for revolutionaries, as I say, nothing is ruled in or out tactically. We could, if an EDL member did come in here now and wanted to debate, I'm not quite sure what debate they'd want, but I'd actually answer the questions or listen to. I've got no problem with that. Just as I have got a problem with, at some point in the future, at some specific time, gunning him down. I mean, that's the approach we have to have. I mean, it's not a question of being attached to this or that principle, like social democracy has it, that we can't possibly do that because we believe in the state. And the state apparatus, or the anarchists, or I couldn't possibly do that because, well, my purity as a revolutionary is therefore violated, etc. I'm scared of my own political shadow, as the Trotsky puts it. So nothing is ruled in or out. But it's quite clear that if there was a move to, take on an Afghanistan conference, that the left would have to organise rigorous self-defence of that conference, so that we can go on and organise our conference and actually have then the discussions necessary with inside that, free from intimidation, etc., etc. And I'm sorry, but for all the stuff that is said about the EDL as a major threat, I mean, Comrade Zorowski basically got into a bit of trouble at Marxism for basically handing out leaflets to an alternative event. And they said, "Oh, we're sorry," and he was pushed around, etc., and intimidate, "I'll rip your head off," etc., etc. And their basic thing was, "Well, I'm sorry, we're a bit high stressed because there's talk of the EDL turning up, but 2 people on the door, So, and no offence to you, Matthias, security, they would have struggled stopping you getting in on that level if you really want. So it's complete rhetoric, really, in terms of the way it's handled. The United Front approach is absolutely essential in self-defence. There's been a letter in the Weekly Worker recently by a guy called Tony Clark. I think he's some sort of Stalinist influenced thinker, and he's saying, well, okay, it's all well and good, CPGB. You've got your defensive approach. You've got your self-defence. You've got the United Front. That's all well and good. What about the offensive? What do you do? I mean, well, what do you really? We should go out, and he's got that sort of thing. Well, we need to take them on and go on to the attack. He likens it to a war, etc., etc. But the point is about actually going forward and not just reacting to the far right, but actually putting forward some sort of alternative. Is that the United Front on that level is very limited. It is limited to those sort of questions. What we actually have to do is articulate politics and a political criticism of the people that we come into contact with, and in order to push the political thing against the existing state apparatus as is, which as comrades have pointed out in the past, that is the main enemy to our class. That's the people who's locking up people in detention centres, deporting people, etc. That's what we have to channel all of this in. It cannot just be a question of tailing the establishment agenda of official anti-racism, etc., in the name of defeating the BNP. And this is where the offensive comes into question. We have to start arguing for our ideas, not the ideas of Margaret Hodge, not the ideas of David Cameron, but actually our own independent political project at all possible junctures. And the whole question of no platform for fascists as an absolute principle, crushing fascism in the egg, the sectism of we'll be the best fighters, and then little groups saying, well, we'll be the bestest best fighters of this mobilisation, etc. It's all counterposed to that. What is needed is a political alternative, which means, of course, critiquing the statist, nationalist, etc., illusions of the EDL, but also, as I say, of the bourgeois constitutional parties. There is an error in the whole method of this stopping the far right in the name of the legitimate, the constitutional, the acceptable parties, and that it hands these forces, it hands David Cameron, for fuck's sake, the banner of democracy against the extremists of the ideal. That is precisely the point, because from a Marxist point of view, again, this is one of the ABCs that are lost with this approach. The bourgeoisie is not, and never has been, a democratic class. Every democratic right we enjoy, the fact that we can hold this meeting as is at the moment, has been fought for and won and defended against attacks, etc., etc. And that is the point. What is currently the practice of the SWP is to mobilise and mobilise and mobilise, maybe then recruit for a small sect project, not to seriously take on the far right, but actually worse than that, hand the banner of democracy to UKIP, the Conservative Party, and the other decent elements that run through society, as Jack Straw put it. Thank you. Quite rightly, I think you agree, develop a position where the no platform for fascists as a principle is wrong, etc. But when does it then shade into, when is it appropriate to take to stop them speaking, organising, especially if a community is threatened? And I think that really does. Obviously, it's tactics, but what it reflects is a changing threat, a different beast, if you like. The nature of the beast is slightly different in terms of the EDL. I know they've been said to be turning up to left events occasionally and say, well, I want to debate you, discuss with me, etc. But they're obviously, their focus is fundamentally different to that of the BNP, which is the point that I'm trying to make. So in elections, for example, I think there's some wonderful examples of you cannot possibly debate the Nazi BNP. I think in Leeds there was a case where they pulled out they had election hustings, right? And they pulled out the whole parties except for the BNP. So the UAF had actually said, we can't possibly speak, any candidate that speaks with this guy on the platform is a traitor, etc. And I think the AGS, the Alliance for Against Socialism, said, well, this is nonsense, because now it's just the BNP candidate speaking. Everyone else, the Tories, the Lib Dems, have gone out, right? So my point is that in dealing with something like the BNP, I think it's stupid in election hustings at the end of the given period to say, well, I can't possibly go on this platform with you and rip up your ideas. If then in Sheffield, for example, there's the EDL are consciously saying we're going to march into this community or we're going to have a demonstration here, it's not then the same thing, is it? And you have to deal with it in a different fashion. Comrades have raised points then about how to mobilise, and I think Anne made a passing point to it about the CPGB, Paratin and all the rest of it, we know that history, but what that shows is that the CPG was, and they, not like bussing people up to a certain town for a Barney essentially with the police, but actually what it was able to do, because it was a party formation, was actually mobilise in the community itself. And mobilise the local people, which is again bounces off what James was saying about, okay, well, there's this demo, but then what happens afterwards? And this is really the fundamental question. If you're not able, due to the division of the left, the weakness of the left, to actually steadily mobilise and win support gradually, then that's inevitably going to happen, is it? So I think, where does this no platform thing stop? I think it just reflects the response has to reflect the different nature of the threat posed, because, like I say, the EDL is different. In terms of, I agree with John on being more than the left, depends what you mean by the left. And also, again, maybe picking up on Nick's point here, the party and how it's built, in a way, because fundamentally, I agree we should mobilise as a point in all sorts of situations for self-defence of communities, our conferences, whatever, if they're attacked. But what we have to do, that there is a limit to that as well. What fundamentally has to happen is to break with some of the ideas that lie behind it, the fetishes and all the rest of that I've outlined. Building a communist party and the force that we need, I don't think is going to happen by us going out, and I know you're not suggesting that, but onto the estates and win support. Primarily, what has to happen is that the left, as it is, needs to sort itself out, all right, and actually break with a lot of the nonsense that it upholds, and it does uphold a lot of nonsense that we'll hopefully be investigating in the course of this week at Communist University and where it comes from, etc., etc. That's the fundamental question. So yes, we have to go mobilise for these things, but it's crucially a political battle. So, and that's why the ideological battle, the battle for ideas, is absolutely central, because we have just assumed a lot of muck that is actually acting as a barrier to the reformation of our class into a political force, and this is just one of the examples of it, I think, in the way it's done. Anti-fascist action. I mean, there was all sorts of groups that attempted to do these systems, and they were particularly, what's the word, consistent and violent, weren't they, in carrying and in actually taking on the far right authority. But the point to be made would be that it didn't work. I mean, okay, they managed to break up the NF effectively. They hurt a lot of their leading members rather badly. But it's the political question that has to come out of it, and they're basically now in what's the independent working class association, just doing very low level localist political work, which I'm sure in one way is very useful. But it's the bigger questions that these things have failed to answer that really is the problem. So in summary then, really, I think we do have to recognise that the EDL, who knows what will happen. I don't really take your point completely about its strength, because I think at the moment it's very amorphous. I've made the point as well about the different divisions and internal hatred, etc., and rivalry, etc. There's also the question, I mean, they're very loosely organised around, primarily around the internet, as far as I understand it at the moment. Who knows what will happen? I mean, but we have to take on board, given what is going on in the world at the moment, given what is coming for our class, things can change very, very quickly. And we have to recognise that the EDL is a threat and deal with it appropriately in the correct way, and not to just lump it onto the BNP as the same thing, Nazi this, Nazi that. The EDL aren't Nazis, comrades, and actually throwing the term Nazi at them isn't going to work. I mean, we watched that video of them, they're burning the Nazi flag, and all the rest of it. They're a fascistic movement looking to go for the streets, but they're not Nazis. So in terms of dealing with them and dealing with their ideas and actually winning civil support, we have to have some purchase on reality, and the reality is they are not the Nazi wing or fighting wing of the BNP.
Before you finish, so we're describing this fascistic organisation, and we're going to have several thousand marching in a northern town in 2 or 3 weeks' time. What should the weekly workers be saying about that?
Well,
this is concrete. It's not like you can always say if we have a concrete event happening in 2 or 3 weeks' time. What should the weekly workers say?
It should be saying that the workers' movement should organise to defend that community. Absolutely, independent. It's the same as we've been doing in all sorts of these things, and actually striking community roots rather than just busloads of people going up and getting into a barney with the cops. Okay, is that all right?
Unfortunately,
I think could maybe have a dialogue after the meeting.
Certainly it's not real, is it? Because trade unions in most towns ain't going to deliver much. So therefore you're talking about, the left, which I imagine is relatively small in Bradford. I don't know, unless it's seeing everything's some kind of red fucking centre. It's relatively small. So we're talking about the relatively small organisations that exist in Bradford, probably numbering maybe 24 people in total, spread across 3 or 4 organisations, attempting to mobilise the local community, Asian community. That's what we're talking about, yeah? And you're also saying it's not about busting people in. The EDL are busting people in from the entire leading country, aren't they?
I take your point on that level. I mean, but the problem is that's obviously not the answer in an immediate sense. All right? We have to actually take this argument further in that the left, currently divided as it is, it has to unite and defend its own organisation, defend communities, etc., etc. But we need to actually break with just that's the answer. We need much bigger solutions, which is actually addressing the question of party and class. Okay.
Let's hope that's done in the next fortnight then.
To be honest with you as well, just a final point. I don't think the weekly worker will sway either way, but right, in fact, it's right to the. Yeah, exactly. I don't think a very good article or headline is going to swing it either way, but it's the right thing to do. Anyway, yes, that's all.